Hello everyone and welcome back to this brand new lesson. In this lesson we are going to cover how to save and load data from the XML file. Specifically what we want to load and save is the questions. Originally we made the questions as a scriptable object. So if you go to our resource folder and we go to our questions, as you can see, these are our questions assets. So if we select one, this is, as you can see, is the question, then settings, and then the answer. How do we load and save questions to the XML file? So what we are going to do is, considering that at the current moment the question is a scriptable object, what we need to do is we will need to redesign the way the question class is. So we obviously don't want to make our class to derive from scriptable object because we want to serialize the class to the XML file. Let's go to our scripts folder, and the first thing we need to do is we need to open up our questions class. So the first thing we need to do is we need to remove and make this class not derived from scriptable object. So let's simply go and let's remove this, to make this class not derived from anything. Then what we need to do is we need to make this questions class to be serialized. So let's simply copy this attribute, and we also don't need this create asset menu attribute. So let's simply replace this attribute with our serializable attribute. The next thing we need to do is we need to move the enum, which is the answer type, from the questions class to outside of all of the classes. So simply place it somewhere like here. Let's simply just say that we want to simply say answer type, and then we don't have to say question dot answer type. So you can wrap this entire thing, like all of your codes, to the namespace, so that this specific answer type would be only accessible if you include, for example, a certain namespace. But that is obviously for you to decide, but I think this is going to be just fine. The next thing that we need to do is, currently all of the variables inside of this class are private. And for the XML to serialize the class and all of its values, all of the variables needs to be, instead of private, it needs to be public. So instead of having this private and then a public getter, we need to turn this simply just into a public string information variable. And that is all we need to do. We simply need to turn all of those variables into public variables instead of the private variables. We also need to do exactly the same thing with our answer. Let's go here and let's turn this to a public variables. And what we also want to do is we want to turn this public struct to a public class. So let's simply replace the struct with a class. Alright, so what we need to do now is we need to include the empty constructor. Let's simply say public answer, and then simply just make this an empty constructor. And we also want to do exactly the same thing inside of our question class. So let's simply say public question, and then simply just make this an empty constructor. And it is important that this constructor does not contain any parameters, or if it contains parameters, that these parameters are optional. Because if you do not do that, then the XML will not be able to succeed in serializing your class. So now let's go back to Unity, and obviously we'll have some errors. So let's open up the game manager. So as you can see, the first error is our answer type, and our answer type before was inside of the question class. So then we would need to do question.answer type, but instead now we need to simply just say answer type, and we don't need to access the question class. And as you can see, that's all we need to do. Then the next thing we need to do is, instead of this get answer type, it's simply just called a type. So let's simply go and let's change, instead of get answer type, just a type. And then the last error inside of this class is right here. And as you can see, this is when we load questions. And we are not going to load questions from the resource folder. So this is not really a relevant code anymore. So let's simply just select this code and let's delete it. And we will get back to this class once we actually implement the entire saving and loading system. So let's simply just delete everything from this method and let's simply save this class and let's head back to Unity. Alright, so as you can see, we still have some errors, and considering that this is a final project, so it already includes the question editor scripts as well as the answer property drawer. Custom inspector script is not relevant to us, so we simply need to just delete this entire folder as well as this custom inspector script inside. And once we delete, this is all we need to do. We also have this property drawer, which is the answer property drawer. And we also don't want to have this because it's not really relevant to us also. So let's simply go and let's delete this property drawer as well. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is we need to simply just delete this entire resources folder because we do not, work with scriptable objects. So we do not need this entire folder, so we can simply just delete it. Alright, and once we deleted this resources folder, the next thing we need to do is we need to start, writing the editor script, and this is the way we are going to load and save data to the XML file. But before we actually going to do that, what we need to do first of all is we need to go to our game utility class, and inside of this class what we are going to do is we are going to put some of the variables. So the first variable that we are going to put inside of this class is going to be our XML file name. So let's simply go and let's say public constant string, and let's call this something like XML file name. And we can put this, obviously you can put any name you prefer, but I'm just going to call this something like questions data, or you can call this something like a game data or something like that, but I'm just gonna call it question data. And let's also put .xml file. So this is going to be pretty much our file name. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a public static string, which is going to be our full path to our file, full location, so where our file is going to be stored. So let's say public static string, and this is going to be XML file path, and this is going to be a getter. And what we are going to do is we are going to return, and what we are going to return is we're simply going to return the path to the file. Obviously you can store this file to any path you prefer. You can store it in streaming assets or something like that, but I'm simply going to store this inside of the project folder, inside of the assets folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to say application, and to access the application I need to include Unity engine. So I'm going to say application.datapath plus, then I need to include the slash, and then what I need to do is, of course, I need to put the XML file name. Alright, then this is going to be our XML file path. It's going to be stored inside of the assets folder. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create a brand new class, which is going to be our game data class. So let's simply say it's going to be a public class, and let's call this something like data. It could obviously be called something like game data or something like that, but I think data is going to be okay. So once we created this class, what we're going to do inside of this class is we are going to create a public questions array, and let's call this something like questions, and by default is going to be equals to null. And let's also include the public constructor, which is going to be just an empty constructor. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to create a couple of methods to write and fetch the data from the XML file and return it. So let's create now a public static void, and this is going to be called something like write. It could be just called write Alright, so considering that this is a static method, we of course need to have an argument which is going to be our data. So let's simply say data, and then let's call this something like data. So we are simply going to write this data that we send to the XML file. So the first thing we need to do is we need to include a couple of namespaces. The first thing is we need to say using system.io, and this will allow us to work with files and directories. Then what we need to do is we need to include system.xml.serialization, and this will allow us to serialize and deserialize XML files. So once we have these namespaces implemented, the first thing we need to do is we need to create a brand new XML sterilizer, and this will simply just allow us to serialize something to the XML file. So let's call this something like sterilizer, and this is going to be a new XML sterilizer. And what we need to put inside of the parentheses is we need to put the type of what kind of class we want to serialize. And obviously what we want to serialize is going to be the data class. So let's simply say type of data. Then what we need to do is we need to start a stream. So to do that, what we first of all need to do is we need to say using, and what we're going to be using is we are going to be using a stream. So let's create a brand new stream, and let's call this something like a stream. And a stream is going to be equals to a new file stream. And what we need to do now is we need to put a couple of parentheses, of course, and we need to put inside of this file stream, we need to put a path to the file as well as the file mode. So the first thing we need to do is we need to put game utility dot XML file path, and then we simply need to put file mode, and we need to put and the file mode is obviously going to be create because we are writing the data. So what we need to do now is we simply need to serialize this data class. So to do that, we simply need to put inside of the using statement, we need to say serializer dot serialize, simply need to put a stream, and then we simply need to put an object which is going to be our data class. And that's all we need to do. And considering that we are using the using statement, we do not need to close this stream because this stream is going to be closed on its own. If we wouldn't use using statement, we would need to, at the very end, close down the stream. But considering that we are using the using statement, we do not need to worry about this. And the next thing we need to do is, considering that we are created this method for writing the data, we need to create a brand new method for fetching the data. So let's say public static data, because we are obviously going to fetch the data and we are going to return that loaded data back. So let's simply call this method something like fetch. And this is going to be extremely similar class. We are simply going to, first of all, include or create a brand new XML serializer. And let's call this something like deserializer, because we're going to, instead of serialize, we're going to deserialize from the XML file, well, to this data class. So let's simply say the serializer equals to a new XML serializer, and we obviously need to put a type. So let's say type of data, and then we need to say that we are using a brand new stream, and the stream is going to be a new file stream, and then we need to put a file path, which is going to be game utility dot XML file path. And then we need to specify the file mode, and the file mode is right now is going to be open, because we want to open this file and we want to deserialize it to the data class. All right, so right now what we need to do is we need to create a brand new variable, and this variable is going to be called something like data, and this data is going to be equals to a deserializer dot deserialize. And what we want to deserialize is going to be a stream, because a stream is accessing this specific file, and once it's accessing this file, it's going to open this file, and then we are simply going to deserialize this file, this XML file, and we are going to store the data into this local data variable. But currently we are storing the object, and what we want to do is we want to return the data class instead of the object. So what we need to do is we simply need to cast this deserializer to our data. So what we are going to do is this deserializer is going to return an object, and then we are simply going to cast this object to be a data class. And then we are simply just returning this local variable, which is our data. And this is all we need to do with our data class. So now let's go back to our game manager. Let's go to our variables. Let's expand the variables. So the first thing we need to do is we need to change, instead of having this public questions array, let's replace this entire thing with a private data. And let's call this something like data. And let's say this is going to be a new data class. And what we want to do is, obviously now we're going to have a bunch of errors, but we can actually solve them really easily. We simply need to say data.questions. So we simply need to go and we need to include this in all of the places. So let's simply say data.questions. And we need to do this in all of the places where we have these errors. Alright, so once we've fixed all of the issues, now what we can do is we can head to the load questions method, and we can actually start loading the data. We are going to replace the name of this method, instead of load questions, to for example something like load data. We can also do is we can change the summary to something like, so function that is called to load data from the XML file. And what we are going to do inside of this method is going to be extremely simple. The only thing that we are going to do, we are simply going to say that data is going to be equals to data.fetch. So we're simply going to call this static method that we just implemented, and we are going to load the data, and we are going to return it back, and we're going to store it into this variable. And that is all we need to do to load the data from the XML file. Alright, and this is all we need to do to load data from the XML file to our game manager. What we need to do now is we need to actually somehow store this the questions and store it into the XML file. So what we're going to do now is we are going to create a brand new editor script, which is going to be an editor window, and we are going to configure all of the questions inside of the editor window, and we are going to write all of the data that we entered to the XML file. So what we need to do now is we need to go to our editors folder, and we need to create a brand new subfolder, and we need to call this something like Windows. And inside of this folder, we need to create a brand new C# script. Alright, and I created a brand new class, which is going to be, well, I called it a data creator window, but of course you can pick a better name. But let's simply open this script, and let's actually start writing this class. So the first thing we need to do is we need to implement a brand new namespace, which is going to be Unity Editor, because we are going to work with editor scripts. So now this class needs to derive, of course, not from model behavior, but from editor window. And now we can just simply delete the update and start methods because we don't need them. The next thing we need to do is we need to implement a brand new serialized field, which is going to be a data class. And let's simply call this something like data. Then what we need to do is we need to implement a brand new serialized object, and let's call this something like serialized object, and this is going to be, well, by default null. Then what we need to do is we need to implement a serialized property, and this is going to be something like data property. Maybe not data property, but questions property. Alright, so the next thing we need to do is we need to create a brand new private method, which is going to be onEnable. And as we know, onEnable is called whenever the behavior is enabled. So what we need to do inside of this method is we simply need to say serialized object is going to be equals to a new serialized object. And the object that we want this serialized object to represent, which is the object that we are currently inspecting, is going to be this class object. Then what we need to do is we need to say that data.questions is going to be equals to a new questions array. And the size of this array is going to be 0. It's simply just going to be an empty array. And the next thing that we need to do is we need to say that questions property is going to be equals to serialized object. And then what we need to do is we need to say find property. And the property that we want to find is of course this data property. So let's simply say data. And what we want to access is we want to access the data's questions property. So let's simply say dot find property relative. So we are simply accessing the property inside of this class, which is the data property, and then we are accessing this its properties relative property, which is the questions property. So let's simply just say questions, and now we are simply accessing the questions property, and we are storing this property inside of this questions property variable. And this is all we need to do inside of this method. So let's simply collapse this. And the next method that we need to do is we need to create a public static method that is going to be used to open this window. So let's simply say this is going to be a public static void, and let's call this something like open a window. And inside of this method, the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a brand new variable, which is going to be something like window. And we can say that the window is going to be equals to editor window dot get window. So we want to get the window, and the window that we want to get is going to be of course the data creator window. Alright, so as you can see, now what we can do is we can put a name of this window, and the window name or the title is pretty much like this. So this window's title is called game, and this one is called scene. So what I want to put as a title is something like creator. So we are simply going to get a brand new window of this type, and we are going to put a title of this window as creator. The next thing that we want to do is what I want to do is I want to restrict the minimum size of this window. And considering that I kind of prepared for this, I already know what minimum size I want for this window. So I simply want to say window.min size is going to be equals to a new vector 2. And inside of this vector, I want to put, this is going to be our width and our height of the window. And the width is going to be 510 pixels. And the height is going to be 344 pixels. So this is the size that I preferred, to be a minimum size for this window, but of course you can experiment and see what works for you best. So the next thing we want to do, and the final thing we want to do actually, is simply just show this window. And to do that, we simply need to say window.show. So essentially what we are doing inside of this function is we are simply getting the window, we are setting the minimum size, and we are simply calling this show method to actually show the editor window. And what we want to do is we want to create a brand new menu item. So for example, something like here, like window, component, help, and so on. And we want to create this menu item. Whenever we're going to press on this menu item, we are going to call this method, and we are going to open this this window. So what we need to do is we want to First of all, go here and we want to create a brand new attribute. And this attribute is going to be called menu item. So what I want to do is I want to say game slash, for example, data creator. Alright, so now let's go back to Unity and let's see what is going to happen. So as you can see now in here, we have this brand new menu item, which is the game. When we press on the game, we have this data creator menu item. And if we press on this data creator, and as you can see, we have opened a brand new data creator window. Of course, at the moment, this is completely an empty editor window, as you can see. We need to create a brand new method, and inside of this method, which is called onGUI, we will need to implement all of the contents of this editor window. Alright, and as you can see, we have this error message, and if you press on this error message, it points to this line. And the reason why we are getting this error is because currently the data variable is a null value, and we are trying to access, well, property, which is in this case a data's questions property. And we obviously cannot do that because data is equals to null. So what we need to do is we need to say that data is going to be equals to, by default, is going to be equals to a new data class. Alright, so as you can see, we are getting some errors, and even though we fixed this issue, the next issue is that we do not find this data property. And the reason why we are not getting this property is because the data class is not serialized. So we need to go to game utility, and we need to include a new system.serializable attribute. So we need to mark this data class as serializable. And this is actually really important because if this class is not going to be a serialized class, we are not going to be able to save it to the XML file. Alright, so let's go back to this class, and actually let's go back to Unity and let's see if this is now going to work. And as you can see, we are not getting any issues, so it means that everything is now working as it should. So let's go back to this script and let's actually start writing the editor window content, so all of the GUI elements. So this is not going to be particularly a long class because this is not really going to be a complex window. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a brand new private void, which is going to be on GUI. Everything we want to be included inside of this editor window needs to be put inside of this specific onGUI method. Alright, so what we can do now, the first thing is we can create a brand new header. So to do that, the first thing that we need to do is we need to implement a brand new rectangle. And this is going to be a rec, and let's call this something like header rec, and this is going to be equals to a new rec. And a rec is simply just the position and the scale of the element. So it's going to be an X and Y position and width and the height of the element. So if the position is going to be 0, 0, then the element is going to be positioned at the top left corner of the window. So I want to position this header element to the 15 on X and 15 on the Y position. Then the width I want to be this positions, and the position is simply just this window's rec, which is the coordinates and the scale, and I want to put the width of this window minus 30 pixels, and the height I want to be 65 pixels. Alright, so once we defined the coordinates and the scale of the element, we can actually now create and display the element. So the first thing that I want to display is the GUI box. So to do that, let's say a GUI.box. And this method, which is the box, GUI box, requires the rec position as well as the text. And the position is going to be, of course, the header rec. And as you can see, it also requires the GUI content, but we do not need any title or the tooltip for this simple GUI box. So let's simply say GUI content.none. and that will say that we don't want any GUI content. And now if we go back to Unity, we should have this header GUI box appear. And as you can see, now we have this simple looking box. All right. So the next thing we want to do is we want to actually display the header itself. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a brand new GUI style, and we can call this something like header style. And as a parameter, I want to put another style, and the style that I want to put is going to be editor styles.large label. So I'm simply just creating a brand new GUI style, and I'm saying that this new GUI style needs to be identical to the large label GUI style. Alright, so once I have this, obviously I want to change some settings of this GUI style. So the first thing I want to do is I want to say header style dot font size needs to be equals to 26, and then header style dot alignment needs to be equals to text anchor dot upper left. All right, and this is all we need to do for our header style. All right, so what we need to do now is we actually need to display the header itself. So let's say GUI dot label, and the first thing we need to do is we need to obviously put the position, and this is going to be the header rec. And then we need to put the GUI content, but we don't need a tooltip. We simply need just the text as a label. So let's put this to be something like data to XML creator, for example. And we obviously want to also put this new header style. So let's simply put comma and let's say header style. All right, so let's save this script and let's go back to Unity. All right, as you can see, we have this data to XML creator GUI label. But I kind of want to shift this a little bit to the right. So what I'm going to do is let's go back to script. And before we actually display this label, I want to modify the headers rec just a little bit. So I want to say the header rec.x is going to be plus equals to 5, as well as the header rec.y, which is the y position, needs to be plus equals to 5. And let's also, for example, say that header rec.width is going to be minus equals 10, as well as header rec.height is going to be minus equals to 10. And now if you go back to Unity, and now as you can see, the label is kind of shifted a tiny bit to the right and to the bottom. So it looks just a tiny bit better. So the next thing we want to do is, what I want to do is I want to implement this summary text. And the summary is gonna be kind of like a description or like a help text or a hint text. So to do that, I want to implement a brand new rec. And this is going to be called something like summary rec. And this is going to be a brand new rec. And then we need to, of course, define the coordinates as well as the width and the height of this GUI element. So the x position is going to be the header rec.x plus 25 pixels. So we're going to start at this point and we're going to shift it 25 pixels. Then what we need to do is we need to define the y position of this element. And the y position is going to be header rec.y plus header rec.height minus something like 30 pixels. So we are going to simply position this element at this point, which is we're gonna start at this location, and then we're going to say plus header rec height, which is going to be this point. And then we're simply going to shift it 30 pixels up, which is going to be somewhere here. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to put the width of this element, and the width of this element can be something like header rec.width minus 50 pixels. And then the height of this element can be something like 15 pixels. All right, and the next thing we need to do is, of course, we need to actually display the label. So let's simply say GUI.label. Well, first of all, we need to put the rec, which is going to be the summary rec, and then we need to put the actual summary text. And then as a summary, we can put something like rate the data that needs to be included into the XML file. So then we can simply save this and we can get back to Unity. Alright, so as you can see, the summary text is actually positioned in not really a correct way. So let's go back to a script and let's, where we set the Y position, let's simply say, instead of -30, let's say something like -20. And now if we go back to Unity, it should actually look much better, as you can see. So after we implemented both of these things, now what we need to do is we need to implement and define the body, which is the where all of the content is going to be stored. So let's simply go here. And actually, the first thing I want to do is I want to wrap this entire code into a region. So let's say the header section. And let's end the region right here, and then we can simply just minimize this code, and then we can actually create a brand new region, which is going to be the body section. And inside of this section, the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a brand new GUI box. So let's create a brand new rec, which is going to be our body, a rec, and we can say this is going to be a brand new rectangle. And the coordinates of this rectangle is going to be, well, the X position is going to be the 15 pixels. Then the Y position is going to be, so the Y position needs to start somewhere right here. The Y position is going to be equals to header rec dot Y plus header rec dot height. And then we simply need to say plus 15. And then what we need to do is we need to define the width of this element. And the width of this element is going to be the editor windows width minus 13 pixels. And the height of this element needs to be this dot position dot height minus the header rec dot Y plus header rec dot height and minus something like 18 pixels. Alright, so now if we go back here and we create a brand new GUI box and we put the body rec to be at the position and the GUI content, we don't need any, so we simply can say GUI content dot none. So now if we go back to Unity, alright, so as you can see, we are displaying this GUI box, but we have this one issue. As you can see here, this offset is not 15 pixels. And the reason why this is the case is because, as you can see here, we are subtracting 10 pixels from this header rec. So what we need to do here is we need to say that the body rec is going to, in the Y position is going to be header rec.y plus header rec.height plus 20. As you can see, everything is now looking okay. So the next thing we want to do, first of all, we want to actually start displaying the data elements. So to do that, the first thing we want to do, we want to create a brand new variable, which is going to be array size. And we can say that this is going to be equals to data.questions.length. All right, so then what we need to do is we need to define where we want to position the property field. So we need to create a brand new rec, which is going to be our property rec. And this is going to be a brand new rectangle. And the coordinates are going to be the body rec.x plus 10 pixels. And then the Y position is going to be a body rec.y plus 10 pixels. Then the Y position is going to be exactly the same thing. It's going to be body rec.y plus 10 pixels. Then the width of this entire property is going to be equals to body rec.width minus 20. And the height of this element is going to be equals to 17 pixels. Alright, so once we define the rec of the element, which is of the property, we can actually start displaying this property. So let's say editor GUI.property field. And what we need to put as an argument is, of course, the position, which is going to be the property rec. And then we obviously want to put the property, which is going to be the questions property. Alright, so as you can see, we are back to Unity and we can actually now view the questions property. But if we try to, for example, view the elements, we cannot actually do that. So we need to go into our script and we need to put comma whenever we are calling the property field, and we need to say include children equals to true. And if we try to unfold this property, as you can see, now we can actually view the array and we can actually now create these elements. But the problem, as you can see, is that the questions goes outside of the screen, and we do not have any of the scroll bar to view the elements that are outside of the body rec. And to do that, what we need to do is we need to define a new scroll view area. So to do that, let's go back to code. And the first thing we need to do is we need to create a brand new rectangle, and this rectangle is going to be called something like view rec. And we can create, we can say that it's going to be a brand new rectangle. And what this is going to be the entire content area rectangle. So for example, right here at the current moment, the rectangle would be something like in this height. All right, and we also want to make sure that this view rectangle is defined after the body rec is defined. So we need to say, we need to cut this and we need to put this somewhere like here. All right, so what we need to do now is we need to, well, first of all, put the coordinates, and the x position is going to be equals to a body rec dot x plus 10, and the y position is going to be body rec dot y plus 10. Then the width is going to be body rec dot width minus 20, and the height of this view rectangle is going to be the height of the questions property. So to get the height of the property, we need to say editor GUI dot get property height, and the height of the property that we want to get is going to be the questions properties height, and that's all we need to do. So now the next thing that we need to do is we need to create a brand new variable, which is going to be a new private vector2, and this vector can be called something like scroll position, and this can be by default vector2.0. All right, so afterwards we need to define a brand new rec, which is going to be called, for example, something like a scroll position rec, and this is going to be equals to a brand new rec. And what we can actually put is we can put that this rec is going to be identical to a view rec, except that the scroll position rec dot height is going to be equals to body rec dot height minus 20. So this rectangle is pretty much going to be equals to a body rec minus 10 pixels on all sides. Let's fix that typo, and that's all we need to do. So now the next thing we need to do is we actually need to begin the scroll view. So to do that, let's simply say the scroll position, which is the vector, is going to be equals to a GUI dot begin scroll view. And what we need to put as an arguments is, first of all, we need to put the position of this scroll view, which is going to be the scroll position rec. Then we need to put the scroll position, which is going to be the variable that we just created. Then what we need to do, as you can see, we need to put the view rectangle, which is what we created right here. So let's simply say view rectangle. Then what we need to do is we need to say that always show horizontal equals to false, and always show vertical is also needs to be equals to false. Then what you need to do is we need to say that horizontal scroll bar GUI style needs to be equals to GUI style dot none, and the vertical scroll bar GUI style needs to be equals to a GUI dot skin vertical scroll bar. And that is all we need to do to actually begin our scroll view. All right, so obviously once we begin the scroll view, we obviously need to end it. So let's go somewhere here, and let's say GUI dot end scroll view. So as you can see, we are beginning a brand new scroll view. Inside of here, we are defining all of the things that needs to be inside of the scroll view, and then afterwards we're simply ending this scroll view. And now as you can see, we are having this scroll bar that we can actually use to view all of the hidden elements. Alright, so what we need to do now is we need to actually make sure that our property shifts a bit to the left if our scroll bar is actually currently drawing, because as you can see, some of the elements are overlapping with the scroll bar. So let's go back to script. So what we need to do first is we need to check if we are currently viewing the scroll bar. And to do that, we need to first of all create a brand new variable, which is going to be draw slider. And this is going to be equals to viewRec.height. If it's more than scroll position rec.height, then it means that we're actually drawing the slider. Because if we go back to Unity, this, as you can see now, we are actually not viewing the scroll bar, and it is only because our view rectangle's height is not more than the actual scroll position rect's height. So the scroll position's rect's height is actually right here. It ends at this point, and the view rectangle's height is actually the height of the property. So at the current moment, the height of the view rectangle is somewhere right here, because this is pretty much the height of the property. If the property goes outside of the scroll positions rectangle, which goes outside of this point, so it's like here for example, then it means that we are viewing the slider. So we're pretty much displaying the slider to reveal all of the hidden outside elements. We can actually do this right here. So we can say bodyRec.width minus, then what we need to do is we need to check if we are drawing the slider. So let's say if draw slider, if it's equals to true, we need to subtract from the body.width 40 pixels. If it's not the case, we need to subtract 20 pixels. Alright, so now let's go back to Unity. As you can see, this scroll bar is actually now viewing, and our elements is shifted 20 more pixels to the left. So for example, if we collapse some of the elements, as you can see, it shifts whenever the slider is actually drawing. The next thing is we actually need to apply all of the modified properties. So currently, if we are, for example, changing some of the values inside of this property, we are not actually, well, updating this property. So what we need to do is we need to say serialized object dot apply modified properties. All right, so after we created this body section, what we need to do then is we need to actually create the navigation. And the navigation is going to be simply just two buttons to load the data from the file and to save the data to a file. So let's simply just go here and let's create a brand new region. And let's call this something like a navigation. All right, so the first thing is, of course, we need to create a brand new rectangle. And this is going to be our create button rectangle. So let's say create button rec. And it's going to be equals to a new rectangle. So the x position is going to be equals to bodyrec.x plus bodyrec.width minus 85 pixels. And 85 is pretty much going to be the actual width of the button. So then we need to put the y coordinates. And the y coordinates is going to be equals to bodyrec.y plus bodyrec.height plus 15 pixels. Then the width of this element, or specifically this button, is going to be equals to 85 pixels. And the height of this button is going to be equals, for example, something like 30 pixels. Then what we can do is we can create a brand new boolean, and we can call this something like pressed. And pressed is going to be equals to GUI.button. The first thing is, of course, we need to put the position of this GUI element, and the position is going to be create button rec. Then what we need to do is we need to put the either GUI content or simply just a string of the title of this button, or like a label. And the label is going to be create, and the GUI style is going to be equals to editor styles dot mini right button. Alright, so afterwards we need to check if we pressed on the button. So we need to check if pressed, then of course we need to write the data. So we need to say data dot write, and then we simply need to put the data, and we need to write that data. Afterwards, we need to create a brand new button. So let's say pressed is going to be equals to GUI button. All right, then what we need to do is we need to obviously create a brand new rectangle. Or actually, we don't need to create a brand new rectangle. So let's rename this rectangle to be something like a button rec. And then we can say that the button rec.x is going to be minus equals the button rec.width. And then what we can do is we can simply say that the position of this new button is going to be the button rec. The label is going to be, well, for example, something like fetch, and the style of this button is going to be equals to editor styles dot mini left button. And then what we need to do is we need to obviously check if we press the button. What we need to do is we need to say that data is going to be equals to data dot fetch. Then what we need to do is we need to apply the modify properties. So let's say serialized object dot apply modify properties, and we also want to update this object. So let's say serialized object dot update. All right, so let's go back to Unity. And now as you can see, we have these brand new two buttons that you can actually press and either create or fetch the data from the file. If we would right now press fetch, we would get an error because currently the file is actually not found. So what we can actually do is is probably a good idea to do is let's go back to game utility, and whenever we're going to fetch the data, let's check if the file .exist, the path is going to be gameutility.xml file path, and if it doesn't exist, actually we are simply going to return from this function, because we cannot fetch any data if there's no data that we can actually load. So we are simply just going to return a null value, or we can actually simply return a new a new data. Alright, so now let's go back to Unity, and if we are actually going to press fetch, we are simply going to return an empty data class. But the problem is that, as you can see, we are getting this null reference exception. And the reason why we're getting this is because the questions class is actually equals to null. So to change that, there's a couple of ways we can do this. What we can do is we can say that the questions array is going to be equals to, instead of a null value, is going to be equals to a new question array. So now let's go back to Unity, and now as you can see, everything is now working as it should. So now if we, for example, create a couple of elements and we press fetch, we're simply going to fetch nothing. What we can actually do, for example, let's say that we have like 4 elements, and then we press fetch by accident, and then we override everything into just an empty data class. All right, so what we can actually do now is we can actually check if we fetched the data so successfully, meaning that we actually found the file and we loaded the data and we fetched that data back. So to do that, let's go back to game utility and let's create a brand new out parameter, which is going to be a boolean, and let's call it something like result. And if we, for example, do not find any file, the result is going to be equals to false. And if we located the file and loaded the data back, the result is of course going to be equals to true. So now let's go back to window, and what we need to do is we need to create a brand new local variable where we're going to store that result and then result. And of course, as you can see, we have this issue with a version of the C#. Let's go back to Unity, and what we need to make sure is we need to go to edit, project settings, and we need to go to player, scroll down. So what we need to make sure is our scripting runtime version is not equals to 3.5 but 4x. And let's press restart, and that means that it will restart Unity for us, but that is okay. So let's simply press restart. Right, so when it's done, let's simply just close down this player settings window. Then let's go back to our script. Alright, so inside of the game manager, now let's actually uncomment this line whenever we fetch the data. But we're actually gonna get this error which says that it requires the out parameter. But we actually don't really need that in game manager. for example. So we can create a public static data, and this is going to be equals to fetch with no parameters. And what we can actually put inside of this method is simply just say fetch, and then we simply need to return whatever this function is going to return. But of course, we don't want to call this function, we want to call this function. So let's simply say out bool result. So what we are essentially doing, whenever we are calling this function, we are simply calling this function and we are returning whatever this function returns. So let's actually go back to our game manager, and now as you can see, it does not complain anymore. All right, so let's go back to our window class, and let's also uncomment this line as well. And now what we can actually do is we can say that if result equals to true, what we can actually do then is the first thing what we need to do is, instead of storing the result back to the data variable, let's store it into a local variable. So let's, for example, create a brand new variable, and then if the result comes back as true, meaning that we actually fetch some data, let's say that the data is going to be equals to whatever is stored inside of this data variable. All right, so now let's go back to Unity, and now let's say, for example, we have like 5 elements, and if we press fetch, nothing happens because what we are returning is simply just an empty class, and that is all we need. So what we can actually do now is we can actually, for example, create a couple of questions. All right, so we created these 2 questions. Now we can press create, and if we go back to our assets and we refresh the project, as you can see, we have this brand new XML file, and we have all of the questions stored inside of this XML file. So let's open this file inside of the Visual Studio, and as you can see, this is how the data looks like. So we have the questions. The question has the answers, which is the answers right here. Then it has the parameters, and you can actually just simply copy, for example, this one, and you can, for example, create a brand new answer and put something like rice, and this is obviously true. So this question now has 3 answers. All right, so now let's go back to Unity, and let's say, for example, we close down this window and we open this window. For example, next time, what we can actually do is we can press fetch, and now as you can see, we fetch the data from the XML file, and we actually now have all of the questions displaying right here. And as you can see, we have this brand new answer that we just defined, which is rice. All right, so this is pretty much done. We can actually now create all of the questions, and we can store it into an XML file. We can also fetch the data from the XML file and return, well, all that data. So let's try to, for example, play the game, and let's see if we can actually fetch that data and display all of the questions from the XML file. And as you can see, choose correct answer, and these are all of the answers. So obviously these 2 answers are correct. As you can see, we gain 50 points, and the answer is correct. So now let's say, for example, the metal is correct answer, which is incorrect. And as you can see, this was a false answer, and we subtracted like I think 20 points from the total amount of score that we have. All right, so there is one tiny issue that we are having. So if we, for example, try to play the game and we get less points than 0, as you can see, it says -15, but actually our current final score is -25. The method that we created before, which is calculate score, the score value is equals to 0, and while the score value is less than the current final score, we want to add to the score value 1 every single frame. But the problem is that it's never going to be less than the current final score, because final score is already less than 0. So what we actually need to do, first of all, we need to check if the score is negative. Obviously, if you, for example, don't want to subtract the score, or you want the minimum score to be 0, not go to the negative side, you can simply just, whenever you update the score in the game manager, which is right here, you can actually check if events.current final score, if it's less than 0, then you can simply say that events.current final score is equals to 0. And that will make sure that your score is never going to go below 0. Is let's create a brand new variable and let's check if the score is positive. So what we're going to do, we're going to check if score more than 0. And the way we're going to determine this is simply saying if events.current final score, if it's more than 0, that means that the current final score is more than 0. What we need to do then is we need to go into our while loop statement and we need to check if score more than 0. If that's the case, then we need to check if the score value is less than current final score, or if it's not more than 0, then what we need to do is we need to check if the score value is more than current final score. And what we need to do now is we need to update the score value. So the score value is going to be plus equals, and if score is more than 0, is going to be plus equals 1, and if it's not, is going to be plus equals minus 1. And what we can actually also do is we can check if events.current final score is equals to 0, then we can simply say that the text is going to be equals to 0 to string. And then we simply want to return from this coroutine because that's all we need to do. We cannot say return. What we need to do in a coroutine, we need to say yield break. So let's go back to Unity and let's try to play test this game. So now let's say, for example, we get a less than 0 points. And as you can see, our points is displaying correctly, which is minus 25. But if we, for example, play this game again, and if we get, for example, more than 0, we are getting 25 points, which is working perfectly. All right, so this is this issue dealt with. All right, guys, so this is pretty much it for this video. I also wanted to talk about one more thing before I wrap this video up. And some of you guys were asking me about how to make levels in your game. So for example, load assets from the specific folders in a resource folder. Each subfolder represents a separate level. And you want to load the content of each specific folder depending on the level. So I already answered this question on my Discord. So if you join the official WatchFindDo Media Discord server, you can actually find this answer in one of the help channels, which is, I believe is a coding channel. And there I already answered this question. But if you, for example, want to do this thing with an XML file, it's actually exactly the same thing. You can do, for example, you can go to Game Manager and you can, for example, implement an integer, or you can actually implement this integer in game events, which is even more convenient. So let's say a public integer level, and by default this is going to be like a 1, which is the first level. And whenever you finish the game, you can simply say events.level++, meaning that you finish the level. And what you can actually do is you can define the max amount of levels. So let's say, for example, public constant integer and max level, and max level could be something like 4. And what you can actually do is you can go to Game Manager again. Then what we can do is we can check if the current level is already more or equals to a max level, which is actually it's a constant. So we need to say game events dot max level. If that is the case, if our next level actually is already a max level, meaning that we already finished the game, for example, say that events.level is equals to 0, meaning that we repeat the game and we can actually play it again. So you can of course do pretty much anything, and whenever you're fetching the data, you can go to the fetch data method, and then let's simply say a string file path. So what kind of obviously file we want to load, and this is also needs to be included right here. And then we simply want to load a file in this in a file path instead, and then say that this one needs to be equals to file directory, and this could be equals to application.datapath plus the slash. And then what we can do is we can say that the constant is going to be equals to file name, and then what we can do is we can say that file name is going to be equals to q, and let's say that whenever we are trying to fetch the data, we want to say that file, and we of course need to include the system.io, and then actually not a file but path.combine, and then we need to combine game utility dot directory path with game utility dot file name plus events dot level plus plus, and then we simply need to, or we can say combine also with the extension, which is .xml. The file name is going to be, well, it's going to start with q and it's going to end with the level. So for example, for the first level, the file name is going to be q1.xml, which is right here. So this file, and then whenever we're going to finish this level, we're going to say level plus plus, and then next time we're going to fetch the data, we're going to say that the file name is going to be equals to q2 plus xml, which is this level, this file. And that is all we need to do. In the editor script, we are fetching the data whenever we press fetch, but of course we cannot actually, we need to specify the path or what kind of data we want to fetch. So what we can actually do instead is we can actually open the file picker, and to do that we can say, first of all, a variable path is going to be equals to editor utility dot open file panel, and what we need to do now is we need to say the title, which is going to be select. Our directory can be something like assets and extension XML. And what we need to do then is we need to check if string is null or empty, which is the path, is equals to false, meaning that the path that was returned is not equals to null or empty. What we are going to do is we are first of all going to copy this entire thing. We are going to put this in here, and then we are simply going to say that we want to fetch the data from this path. And the next thing that we want to do is we actually want to put this into a separate variable, which is the path, because whenever we're going to fetch the data, we obviously will also want to, of course, save the data back to this file. So for example, we fetch the data, we added this file's content, and then we press save, and we simply just save the data back to this file. So obviously we need to keep track of the path of the file that we fetched. So we simply need to say that the path is going to be equals to whatever we're going to select. And then whenever we're going to write the data to the file, what we are going to do is we are going to say if a string dot is empty or null, which is the path. What we are going to do then is we are going to say path is going to be equals to the editor utility dot save file panel, and this will require us to put the title of this panel is going to be save. The directory, let's put it into the assets folder. The default name could be something like, for example, game utility dot file name, and the extension is going to be XML. And then what we're going to do is we are simply going to put, whenever we're going to write the file, we also want to specify, of course, the path. So let's simply just put another argument, which is going to be a string, which is going to be a path. And inside of the creator window, we are simply checking if we are currently, because if the path is equals to null, meaning that we actually haven't opened any file before, and we are simply just creating a brand new file. So then we are simply able to select and define the name of this new file, and then we save this new file to that location. But if we fetch the file, then the path is not going to be equals to null or empty, and then we are simply going to just save the opened file, and that is all. Is whenever we are trying to fetch the data, we are checking if the file exists. But of course we want to put this as a path. If we're going to go back to Unity and we're going to try to fetch the data, for example this Q1 data file, as you can see, we fetch the data from that file, and we, for example, now add a brand new question, for example, something different, and we press create, and now as you can see, we have this additional new question. Now we can actually fetch another file, which is a second level, and we can actually, for example, add another question. And if we, for example, now we're going to create this or update actually this file, we are actually going to update this second file, and now as you can see we have two questions. So our XML creator is done. So let's close down this window, and now whenever we're going to try to play this game, let's see what's going to happen. So let's actually go to our game manager and let's make sure that everything is correct, and I think that everything is correct. So now, considering that we have two data files, our max level is 2, so let's put 2 as our max level, and let's go now to game manager and to accept answer, and whenever we finished the level, we need to make sure that if our next level is more than max level, we want to say that the next level is going to be the first level. And what we need to change is we need to change that our events level is going to be equals to 1. So meaning that the first level, of course you can have it 0, then you have to rename this file to be, instead of Q1 to Q0. Q0 is going to be the first level file, which is actually what I would prefer to do, but considering that we already kind of made this, so let's simply just save this and let's see if this is now going to work. Alright, so let's try to play this game. Alright, so we're getting an error. Let's see what is the problem. Alright, so I made a silly mistake. As you can see here, this is our complete path, which is the directory, then the file name, and then /.xml, which is obviously not what we want. We want to say the file name .xml. So what we need to do is we need to, instead of saying comma .xml, we need to say file name plus .xml. And now if we try to play this game, as you can see, we are loading the questions from the first file. So let's, for example, answer these questions. Alright, so we answered these questions, and now we're going to play this game again. And you can say, for example, instead of play again, something like next level. Alright, so as you can see, we are loading questions from the second file, which is Q2. And this is a completely different question. So now we are answering these questions. And now if we, for example, try to play this game again, we are loading questions from the first file. Alright, and this is pretty much how you can make levels in your game. Of course, you can improve the interface to make it more apparent and maybe create even some sort of unlockable levels or something like that. But that is, of course, for you to decide how you want to design your game. If you have any questions, please join the Discord server. Of course, the link to my Discord is going to be in the description, or you can find the pinned comment, which is going to be the very first comment. Alright, so we are going to wrap up this video because it's probably going to be quite long already. And that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you very soon in the next lesson.